You actually brought the laughter cut across the great hall the moment Caleb Foster, a widow janitor at the Sinclair Corporation, set his gift on the table before the birthday guest of honor. It was only an old wooden box in front of hundreds of wealthy strangers. Charlotte Sinclair mocked it, called it unworthy of her party, and dropped it to the floor, shattering the music box inside. Caleb knelt, gathered the broken pieces, spoke one quiet sentence, and walked out. By morning, the billionaire wanted him found. For almost 6 years, Caleb Foster had learned the Sinclair Corporation the way few people ever would. He knew which elevators ran slow after midnight, which office lights stayed on when the ambitious one stayed late, and which corners of the marble lobby caught dust no matter how often he swept them. He was 38, a widower, and he wore his gray janitor's uniform the way other men wore suits, without apology. The work was not glamorous, but it had kept a roof over his head and a small measure of dignity in his chest, and for that he had never once complained. He had a way of moving through the building as if he belonged to it, though no one important ever noticed him. Executives passed him in the halls without meeting his eyes, and he had long ago stopped expecting them to. That did not make him bitter. Caleb had decided years earlier that a man could not control how others saw him, only how he carried himself, and he carried himself with a quiet steadiness that some of the older staff had come to rely on without quite knowing why. The tower belonged in name and in spirit to Charlotte Sinclair. She was 30 years old and had inherited the corporation before most people her age had figured out what they wanted from life. She was sharp, decisive, and unafraid, and those qualities had made her formidable in boardrooms full of men who had expected her to fail. But wealth has a way of narrowing the eye even as it widens the reach, and somewhere along the way Charlotte had begun to measure the worth of things and of people by their price. What could be bought impressed her. What could not be bought? She had mostly forgotten how to see her birthday that year was to be celebrated the way she celebrated everything now, on a scale meant to be noticed. She had reserved the great hall on the ground floor of the tower and filled the guest list with names that mattered, financiers and celebrities, and the reporters who followed them. There would be crystal and champagne and a string quartet, and there would be gifts opened publicly, because Charlotte enjoyed the small theater of watching people try to please her. Was understood without anyone saying it that a gift was really a measure of the giver. Caleb heard about the party the way he heard about most things, in fragments, while emptying bins and wiping down counters in rooms where people spoke as if he were furniture he had no reason to attend and no invitation to speak of. But something in him had been turning over a memory. For weeks, months earlier, he had been cleaning near a conference room when Charlotte, waiting on a call, had drifted to a display case in the hall and remarked almost to herself that she had always loved old handcrafted music boxes. She said her grandmother had owned one once. Then the call came, and she moved on, and she never knew anyone had heard her. But Caleb had heard, and the words had stayed with him. He was not a sentimental man in any obvious way, yet he believed deeply and without argument that gratitude was a debt worth paying. The Sinclair Corporation had carried him through the hardest stretch of his life. Through the year he lost his wife, and the years he spent rebuilding whatever a man rebuilds after that. The company was an institution, not a person, but Charlotte was its face. And when he thought of thanking the place that had kept him standing, hers was the name that came to him. He did not need her to prize the gift. He only meant to give the thanks he owed honestly and be done with it. So in the days before the party, he did something that made no financial sense and every other kind of sense to him. He went looking for a music box. He found one in an antique shop 3 bus transfers from his apartment, a small handcrafted piece of dark walnut with a brass mechanism inside, worn smooth by decades of hands. When he lifted the lid, it played a slow, aching melody that seemed to come from somewhere much older than the room. The shopkeeper named a price, and the price was nearly a full month of Caleb's wages. He did not have that money to spare. He worked extra night shifts to close the gap, turning down the paid leave he had earned staying long after the offices emptied. When that still was not enough, he sold the one thing of value. He owned a watch that had belonged to his father, a plain steel piece that had kept time on his wrist for 20 years. He did not agonize over it the way another man might have. He simply decided that a watch measured hours And there were better ways to spend with those. Hours were worth when at last the box was his. He wrapped it carefully and told himself it was the most expensive thing he had ever bought, and also the truest. He was not buying her approval. He knew a man like him would never earn a place among the people in that hall, and he did not want one. He only wanted to say in the one language he had that he was grateful. He believed a sincere thank you was worth more than the sum on any receipt, and he intended to deliver it in person, whatever it cost him to. Walk through that door the night of the party. The great hall glittered. Light poured off the chandeliers and broke against 100 glasses of champagne, and the quartet played something bright and weightless beneath the noise of the crowd. Caleb came in through a side entrance in the cleanest clothes he owned, which were not fine, and he felt the difference the instant he crossed the threshold. Heads turned not with welcome, but with a faint amused confusion, the look people give a man who has clearly wandered somewhere he does not belong. He held the wrapped box against his chest and kept his eyes ahead. A long table near the front had been set aside for the gifts, and they were extravagant boxes from jewelers and watchmakers, envelopes thick with whatever envelopes like that contained. Caleb's package looked small and plain among them, and he knew it. He set it down anyway, with care, the way a man sets down something that matters to him, and he stepped back to stand at the edge of the crowd where he thought he might go unseen. For a while he did. Then the moment came for Charlotte to open her gifts, and she did it the way she did everything as a performance. She unwrapped the expensive things first, holding each one up so the room could admire it, thanking the givers by name, so the reporters could note the connection. Laughter and applause rose and fell around her. She was luminous in the center of all that light, and she moved through the ritual with the ease of someone who had never once doubted she deserved it. When she reached the small parcel wrapped in plain paper, something in her expression flickered. She turned it in her hands, frowning slightly, and pulled the paper away to reveal the old wooden box to her. It looked like nothing, a scuffed antique, dark with age, the kind of thing one might find abandoned in an attic. She had no way of knowing what it had cost, and worse, she did not think to wonder. She only saw that it did not shine. Her eyes lifted and swept the room until they found him, the janitor, in his plain clothes, standing at the edge of the crowd, and understanding settled over her face in a way that was almost cruel in its simplicity. "You actually brought this," she said, and her voice carried light and incredulous pitch for the crowd, rather than for him. A ripple of laughter answered her, uncertain at first, then louder. As people took their cue from her tone, she lifted the box a little higher, so the others could see it, and she smiled the smile of someone sharing a joke at another. "Expense, that's sweet," she said in a way that made it the opposite of sweet, "but I'm not sure this belongs at a party like this." The laughter swelled again, and Caleb stood inside at his face, still, his hands loose at his sides, absorbing the sound the way the marble absorbed the light. What happened next happened quickly. Whether it was carelessness or a small performance of contempt, no one afterward could quite agree, but Charlotte let the box drop. It fell from her hands and struck the polished floor with a sound that did not belong in that room, a sharp wooden crack followed by the bright, broken scatter of the mechanism. Inside, the lid split from the body. The little brass cylinder that had played its slow melody spilled loose and skidded across the marble. And for one strange instant the box gave a single warped note, as if trying to finish the song it had carried for decades before it fell silent for good. The laughter died. All at once something in that broken sound reached even the people who had been laughing, and a hush spread through the hall that no one had ordered. Charlotte looked down at the pieces at her feet with the faint annoyance of someone who had been inconvenienced rather than the alarm of someone who had done harm. She did not yet understand where she had broken. She only knew the moment had turned, that the room had gone quiet, and that the quiet was somehow aimed at her. Caleb crossed the floor. He did not hurry, and he did not look at the guests, and every eye in the hall followed him as he knelt among the fragments of the thing he had given so much to buy. He gathered the pieces one at a time. The split lid, the loosened brass, the small worn parts scattered across the stone, and he handled each of them with a care that was painful to watch precisely because it was so gentle. His jaw was tight. Whatever anger moved in him stayed behind his eyes, held there by a discipline the room had not expected from a man in a janitor's uniform. He did not raise his voice. When he had gathered what he could, he looked up at Charlotte, and he spoke in a tone so level it silenced the last of the murmuring. Some gifts look cheap, he said, only because people can't see the price someone else paid to buy them. The words landed in the stillness and stayed there. He placed the broken pieces back inside the ruined box, closed what was left of the lid, and rose to his feet. He did not wait for a reply, and Charlotte, for perhaps the first time in years, could not find one. He turned and walked toward the side door he had entered by unhurried, his shoulders straight, the small wreck of his gift held against his chest. No one stopped him, no one spoke. The quartet had gone quiet, without anyone noticing, and the only sound in the great hall was the sound of his footsteps crossing the stone, and at last the soft closing of the door behind him. The party did not recover. It went on in the technical sense, glasses refilled and conversations restarted, but the air had changed, and everyone in it knew. People glanced at Charlotte, and then away. The reporters who missed very little had missed none of it. Charlotte stood among her expensive gifts with the quiet ringing in her ears, and did not understand yet why she could not shake the feeling that something had gone very wrong, something a party this perfect was not supposed to allow. She told herself it was nothing. A man had been embarrassed and had made a scene, and men who were embarrassed said dramatic things. She had done worse than laugh at people before, and slept soundly. She lifted a fresh glass of champagne from passing tray and turned back to her guests and let the noise close over the moment like water over a dropped stone. But the stone had gone down, and it had not stopped falling late that night after the last car had pulled away and the caterers had folded the tables and the great hall stood empty and echoing. Charlotte found herself alone near the front of the room. The floor had been swept clean. There was no sign left of the box, or the broken melody, or the man who had carried both out into the dark. Yet she stood there longer than she meant to, looking at the spot on the marble where he had knelt, unable to name the thing that had begun very quietly to trouble her. His sentence returned to her without her wanting it. Some gifts look cheap only because people can't see the price someone else paid to buy them. She had assumed without a second's thought that the box was worthless because it did not glitter, and the assumption had felt so natural that she had never questioned it. Now the ease of it unsettled her. She had spent her whole life certain she could tell the value of a thing at a glance, and a janitor in a gray uniform had made her doubt for the space of one sentence whether she had ever really seen anything at all. She did not know his name. She realized that standing there, and it embarrassed her in a way she could not explain. 6 years he had worked in her building, and she could not have said whether he had a family where he lived, what he had wanted from a life spent cleaning up after people like her. She had looked at him tonight and seen only the uniform and the plain clothes and the dull little box, and she had performed her contempt for a laughing crowd, and the crowd had given her exactly what she wanted, and now the wanting felt like something she should be ashamed of. Charlotte was not whatever else. She was a stupid woman. She recognized the shape of a mistake even when she did not yet understand its size. She told herself she would deal with it in the morning, that a small gesture would smooth it over, an apology, perhaps some compensation, the kind of thing that had always worked. Before she set down her glass, gathered her coat, and left the empty hall. But the trouble followed her out into the night, and it did not leave her. And by the time the city lights had blurred past the window of her car, she already suspected, without letting herself say it, that this was not a thing money was going to fix. She would remember later that the party had been perfect, the right people, the right music, the right light, breaking off 100 glasses of champagne. She had gotten everything she had planned and everything she had paid for. And she would remember, too, that she had thrown away the only gift in that entire glittering room that had cost the giver anything at all, and that she had done it laughing before a crowd of strangers without ever once learning who he was. The resignation letter was on the Human Resources desk before 9 o'clock the next morning. It was short, written in Caleb's plain, even hand, and it thanked the company for 6 years of steady work without a word about the party or the woman who had thrown his gift to the floor. It asked for nothing. It explained nothing. It simply stated that he would not be returning, and it was signed at the bottom in the same careful script he used for everything, as if the ending of a thing deserved as much care as its keeping word of it moved through the lower floors of the tower faster than where the party had the other staff were stunned. Caleb was the one who covered shifts when someone's car broke down, the one who never grumbled about the holiday rotations, the one who had worked in that building longer than most of the executives had held their titles. That he of all people would walk away without notice struck them as wrong in the way weather could be wrong, a thing that simply should not happen. And yet plainly had Charlotte heard about the letter from an assistant who mentioned it in passing the way one mentions a minor administrative matter. She was standing at the window of her office with the city spread out below her, and she did not turn around at first. She had told herself in the car the night before that a small gesture would set it right, and here was proof. She decided that she had overestimated the whole affair. The man had quit in a temper. He had been humiliated, and he had reacted, and men who reacted that way usually reconsidered once his sting wore off and the reality of a lost paycheck settled, and she held to that for most of the morning. It was a comfortable thought, and it required nothing of her, and she had built a life on thoughts exactly like it. But comfort has a short shelf life. When something underneath it has begun to rot, and the something under this had not stopped troubling her since she stood alone in the empty hall, she found herself, without any real intention, walking a floor of the building she almost never walked. Past the small break room where the maintenance staff took their lunches, the door was ajar, and the voices inside did not know she was near. They were talking about Caleb, as everyone that day was talking about Caleb, and what she heard through the gap in the door stopped her. Where she stood, they were not talking about a man who had thrown a tantrum. They were talking about a man who had saved for months for that gift, who had worked doubles and turned down his own vacation to afford it, and the affection in their voices as they said it made the whole thing suddenly unbearably real. Charlotte did not go in. She stood in the corridor with her back near the wall and listened to strangers grieve the loss of a sea worker she had humiliated for sport, and the comfortable version of the story she had carried all morning came apart in her hands. She had assumed the box was cheap because it looked cheap. She had assumed the man was nothing because he wore a gray uniform. Every assumption had been so effortless, so automatic, that she had never once suspected they might all be wrong at the same time. She went back to her office and did the one thing she could think to do. She asked that the pieces of the broken music box be brought up to her. It took some doing because the cleaning crew had swept the hall that night, and the fragments had nearly gone out with the trash, but someone had thought to save them in a plastic bin, and within the hour the bin was sitting on the wide glass surface of her desk. She stood over it for a long while before she could bring herself to reach in. She began, without quite deciding, to fit the pieces back together. It was slow, awkward work for hands that had never repaired anything, hands that had only ever pointed at problems and paid other people to solve them. She matched the split lid to the body, found where the worn brass cylinder had come loose, and turned each fragment in the light, trying to understand how it had all once fit the care it demanded of her. Was itself a kind of accusation, and she felt it with every piece. It was while she was working the lining loose from the base that she found the receipt. It had been tucked into the felt at the bottom, folded once the way a man folds a thing he does not want to lose, but does not want to look at. Either she unfolded it on the desk and read the figure printed at the bottom, and the number stopped her cold. She knew roughly what the maintenance staff earned. She had signed off on those budgets a 100 times without reading them. The box had cost him very nearly a full month of his pay. She was still holding the receipt when the logistics manager, a heavy-set, plain-spoken man named Marcus, who had run the building's operations for 2 decades, came up at her request to answer her questions about the janitor. She had never bothered to know. She asked him carefully whether it was true, the saving the extra shifts. Marcus confirmed it without any softness, because softness was not in him. And then he told her the rest, the part the break room had not known in full. Caleb had not only worked the doubles and refused his leave, Marcus said in the last weeks before the party, he had come in one morning without the watch he had worn every single day. For as long as Marcus had known him, a plain steel thing that had belonged to his late father. When Marcus had asked about it, Caleb had said only that he had sold it and had changed the subject. Marcus had not understood why at the time. He understood now, and he did not bother to hide what he thought of the woman who had made that sacrifice. Worthless Charlotte sat with that after he left, the receipt in one hand and the ruined box in front of her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt genuinely physically sick with herself. She had called it cheap. She had held it up for a laughing crowd and named the most expensive thing that man had ever bought, a piece of junk unworthy of her party, and he had knelt at her feet and gathered the wreckage of it. Without once raising his voice, she had thought herself the wrong party for having her evening disrupted. She saw now which of them had actually lost something that night. She wanted to fix it, and the wanting was new and clumsy and did not know where to go. Her instinct, the only instinct her life had trained, was to reach for money, to send something, to write a figure on a check that would make the discomfort stop. But even she understood dimly at first, and then with growing clarity, that a check was exactly the wrong instrument. The man had not been insulted by a lack of money. He had been insulted by being measured with it, and she could not undo that particular wound by measuring him again, more generously. So she began instead to learn who he was, and everything she learned made it worse. She asked quietly around the building, and the picture that came back was of a man who had spent 6 years being invisible on purpose and decent. By habit, he had covered other people's shifts without being asked, and never mentioned it. He had never once used his hardship to angle for a raise or a favor, though everyone knew he could have. When executives complained about the building, he defended it. He spoke well of the company that employed him, even to the people who cleaned the floors beside him, and he had asked nothing of anyone in all his years there. While Charlotte was learning all of this, the world outside the tower was learning something else. Someone at the party had filmed the moment, of course. Someone had. There were phones in every hand in that hall, and a billionaire mocking a poor man's gift was exactly the kind of thing those phones existed to capture. The video began to move through the private channels of the business world, first forwarded between people who knew her, and then it slipped past those channels the way such things always do, and by midweek, it was no longer private at all. The version that spread was short and merciless. It showed her holding up the plain wooden box. It showed her ask, "You actually brought this?" To a swell of laughter. It showed the box hit the marble and break, and it showed a man in a gray uniform kneel to gather the pieces. It did not show the months of saving or the sold watch, because the camera had not known to look for those. It did not need to. What it showed was enough, and the people who watched it drew the obvious conclusion about the kind of person who would do such a thing. The criticism came hard and from every direction. Commentators who had never met her held her up as a symbol of everything wrong with people who had too much. Business acquaintances who had smiled at her party grew suddenly hard to reach. The board, which cared about the company's name more than her feelings, made its displeasure known through careful, deniable channels. For the first time in her adult life, Charlotte Sinclair was the villain of a story that everyone was telling, and she could not buy her way out of the telling. And here was the strange thing, the thing that surprised her most. The public disgrace was not what kept her awake. She had weathered bad press before and known it to be survivable, and she knew, if she were honest, that she had the tools to soften this one to a statement, a donation, a season of keeping quiet until the noise moved on. She could have managed the scandal. What she could not manage was the private knowledge that the crowd, for all its exaggeration, had arrived at the truth that she had crushed a good man's sincerity for a laugh, and had not even both dared to learn his name while she did it. So she made a choice she could not have made a week earlier. She set aside the easy work of repairing her reputation and turned to the harder work of finding the man himself, not to buy his silence, not to stage a photograph of forgiveness, but to stand in front of him and say she was sorry. She decided to apologize, and she discovered that she had waited too long and understood too little to be granted the chance. She called the number the company had on file for him, and it rang and rang and went nowhere. She called again and a third time, and after that the calls did not even ring. He had shut the phone off or thrown it away. or simply decided that whatever she had to say was not worth the hearing, that refusal did something to her that the video and the criticism had not managed. She was a woman accustomed to access to doors that opened and people who answered, and she found that she could not simply summon this man to receive her apology the way she summoned everyone else. His silence was not cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. It was indifference, the plain fact that he did not need anything from her, not her regret, not her money, not her attention, and that there was nothing in her considerable power that could compel him to take any of it. She went to find him herself, because there was nothing else left to try. The company had an address on file, a modest apartment building in a part of the city she had no occasion to visit, and she went therein the late afternoon and climbed the stairs and knocked on a door that no longer answered his name. The landlord found her there, a weathered older man named Gerald, who managed the building and had known Caleb as a quiet, reliable tenant who paid on time and troubled no one. He told her what she had already begun to fear. Caleb was gone. He had settled what he owed and moved out early that same morning. Gerald said before most of the building was even awake, he had not left a forwarding address. And Gerald, who did not know who Charlotte was and would not have cared if he had saw no reason to have asked for one, the man had simply packed what little he owned and walked out into the city. And the city was large, and a man who did not wish to be found in it usually was not Gerald. Let her look into the empty unit, perhaps because something in her face made him pity her, and what she saw there she would carry for a long time. The apartment had been left clean, swept, and wiped down the way a man leaves a place he respects. Even in leaving it, there was almost nothing in it but folded neatly on the bare kitchen counter, square to the corners with a precision that was somehow the saddest thing of all. Sad, his gray janitor's uniform, his employee badge resting on top of it, and beneath them a copy of the resignation letter she had already read. She understood, standing in that empty room, that she had lost more than an employee, and far more than the good opinion of strangers on the internet. She had lost the respect of a man who had gathered up every scrap of gratitude in his hard life and offered it to her, and she had thrown it to the floor for a laughing crowd, without even the excuse of malice, out of nothing worse than the careless certainty that he did not matter. That certainty had cost her something she was only now able to name, and there was no one left in the apartment to name it to. She had spent her whole life believing that any wrong could be corrected quickly, that time and money were interchangeable, and both were hers in abundance. She learned otherwise in that bare room with the folded uniform on the counter. Some mistakes did not wait to be fixed on her schedule. Some of them got up before dawn and walked out the door and took with them the only chance she would ever have had to make them right, and left behind only the neat, silent evidence that a good man had been there and had been more than she ever bothered to see, and was gone. The weeks that followed did not pass the way Charlotte's weeks usually passed. For the first time since she had inherited the corporation, she let the machine of her business run without her hand on it, because she had discovered that the thing troubling her could not be delegated. She sat with it instead. Day after day, she returned to the empty apartment in her mind, the folded uniform, the badge, set squarely on top of it, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she had done, rather than reaching as she always had for the nearest thing that would make the feeling stop. What surprised her as those weeks went on was the shape of the guilt. When she finally looked at it directly, it was not shaped like her damaged reputation. The video still circulated, the commentators still talked, the board still sent its careful signals of displeasure, and she found that none of it reached the center of what hurt. She could survive being disliked. What she could not set down was the memory of a man on his knees before a laughing room, gathering the ruins of his own generosity with a dignity she had never once shown in her privileged life. She began slowly to understand that the party had only revealed a habit she had been practicing for years. Caleb was not the first person she had looked through without seeing. He was only the first who had cost her something by vanishing. She thought about the people who kept her building running, the ones who swept the halls and ran the deliveries and answered the phones, the ones whose names she had never bothered to learn because she had never imagined she might need to. She had built her success on their invisible labor, and repaid them with invisibility, and she had never even noticed the arrangement until one of them refused to disappear on her terms. That was the thing that finally moved her out of her paralysis. She stopped thinking of the problem as a scandal to be managed and started thinking of it as a debt to be paid, though she knew by now that it could not be paid in the currency she was used to. She hired people to help her find him quietly, not to bring him back and not to buy his silence, but only to locate him so that she could say in person and with nothing in her hands the thing she had been unable to say through a phone. He would not answer. It took time. A man who has decided to be unfound is difficult to find, and Caleb had left few threads to follow, but the same qualities that had made him invisible had also made him remembered, and the people who had worked beside him were willing eventually to help once they understood that Charlotte was not looking to do him further harm. A former sewerker knew someone who knew where he had taken new work. The thread was thin, but it held, and it led her at last to a modest building on the far side of the city where Caleb had quietly begun again. Before, when she did the one thing that felt like the only honest preparation available to her. She took the plastic bin of broken pieces that had sat on her desk since that morning weeks before, and she carried it to a workshop run by two old craftsmen who restored antique instruments and clocks, people who understood the patience such things required. She did not tell them who she was or how the box had come to be broken. She only asked whether it could be saved, and she asked them to save it exactly as it had been, worn walnut and old brass, and all, not to make it new, but to make it whole. It cost more effort than money, which was itself a lesson she was still absorbing. The craftsman worked 4 days matching the grain, resetting the mechanism, coaxing the little brass cylinder back into alignment so that it would turn again. When they finished, the box did not look expensive because it had never been expensive in the way she had once meant that word. It looked like what it was, an old handmade thing that someone had loved enough to give and someone else had cared enough to repair. When they lifted the lid to show her, it played its slow aching melody all the way through unbroken, and she had to turn her face away. She went to find Caleb on an ordinary afternoon with a restored box carried carefully in both hands and nothing else. She brought no assistant, no lawyer, no check, no offer. She had spent her whole life arriving places with the machinery of her power arranged around her, and she understood that if she brought any of it now, she would ruin the only thing she had left to offer, which was the plain fact of herself standing in front of a man she had wronged, with no leverage and no advantage and no way to compel a single thing from him. She found him his new work, and the sight of him steadied and unnerved her at once. He looked the same calm and unhurried, carrying himself with the quiet steadiness she had failed to recognize in her own building for 6 years. When he saw her, he did not look surprised, and he did not look angry. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather he has already decided not to let ruin his day, and he waited, without helping her, for her to say whatever she had come so far to say. She held out the box first because words felt presumptuous ahead of it. He took it and turned it in his hands and saw that it had been mended, saw the care and the repair, and something moved across his face that he did not put into words. She told him then plainly, without the polish she used for everyone else, that she was sorry. She told him she had judged the gift by how it looked and the man by his uniform, and that both judgments had been wrong, and that she was ashamed she had ever needed to learn what the box cost him, because she should have simply assumed that any thanks a man offered had cost him something to give. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she had finished, he did not rush to forgive her, and he did not punish her with silence either. He told her in his level way that he had not made the gift to win her approval and had not needed her to prize it for it to have been worth giving the gratitude. Behind it had been real, he said, and that part she had never actually touched. No matter what she did to the box, what had wounded him was not that she failed to like the thing, it was that she had taken a man's honest thanks and turned it into a joke without ever once wondering whether it might have been offered in good faith. She had no defense against that, and she offered none. She said only that he was right, and that she understood now, and that she did not expect the understanding to undo what she had done. And then she asked him, because she had to, whether he would come back to the company. And she heard in her own voice how badly she wanted him to say yes, not for the building's sake, But for her own, as if his return might be the proof that she had been forgiven, he told her no, and he told her kindly. He said he held nothing against her any longer, that he forgave her honestly and completely, but that forgiveness and return were two different things, and he had already begun a new life, and meant to keep walking forward in it. He was not punishing her by refusing. He had simply decided the night he knelt on that floor that he would no longer spend his days somewhere. He had to be invisible to be tolerated, and that decision had freed something in him that he did not intend to give back. Charlotte accepted it, that more than the apology or the search or the mended box was the real measure of how far she had come. Because the old Charlotte would have offered more money, or a better title, would have treated his an opening position to be negotiated. This Charlotte heard his answer and honored it. She thanked him for a forgiveness she knew she had not earned, and he had given anyway. And she left him to the new life he had chosen, and she did not try to follow him into it. She went back to her company changed, and she was careful not to mistake the feeling of change for the fact of a guilt she had learned was easy. It asked nothing of a person, but that they feel bad. What was hard was doing something with it, and she said about the hard thin. She could not make it right with Caleb beyond his forgiveness, but she could make it so that the building he had left behind was not the kind of place that produced men who had to leave it to be seen. She began at the bottom with the people her old self had looked through. She reformed the way the company treated the workers who kept it running, the cleaners and the maintenance crews and the staff whose labor had always been invisible to the people who profited from it. She built protections into their positions that had never existed, real ones with her name behind them. She created a way for their work to be recognized rather than assumed, and she made it known to a board that did not entirely understand her that this was not a public relations gesture, but a standing policy she intended to enforce. She did one more thing, and she did it for herself as much as for anyone. She had the restored music box placed in the main lobby of the tower in a simple case where anyone crossing the floor could see it, and she left no plaque explaining what it was or why it was there. She did not need the explanation. She knew every time she passed it exactly what it was, and she wanted it in her path precisely, so that she could not walk through her own building without remembering the day she had thrown it down and the man who had knelt to gather the pieces. It was not a monument to him. It was a reminder to her. Caleb, for his part, settled into his new work with a lightness he had not felt in years. He had lost the job that had carried him through his hardest seasons, but he had kept the thing that mattered more, which was the plain self-respect that had let him kneel on that floor without shame and walk out with his head level. He did not think often about the party anymore. When he did, it was without bitterness. He had said his one sentence and gathered his pieces and left, and he had been proven right in the only court that mattered to him, which was his own, and that was enough. He never asked for the box back, and he was not sorry to learn when word eventually reached him that it sat in the lobby of the building he had left. It seemed fitting to him that the thing should end up there doing quiet work in a place full of people who had once laughed. He had bought it to say thank you, and it had ended up saying something larger and harder than gratitude, and he was content to let it go on saying it without him. He had never needed to be seen to know his own worth. He simply at last no longer had to pretend otherwise. The video faded the way such things do, replaced by newer outrages and other scandals, and the world moved on and forgot the particulars. But inside the Sinclair Corporation, something did not go back to the way it had been. The people who swept the halls found to their quiet surprise that they were treated differently now that the woman at the top of the tower knew some of their names and had built real protections around their work. And though most of them never knew the full story of why the change was real, and it held, Charlotte Sinclair became, over the years that followed, a different kind of leader than the one who had thrown a gift to the floor for a laugh. She was still sharp and still decisive, because those had never been the problem. What changed was what she chose to see. She had spent the first part of her life measuring worth by price, certain she could read the value of anything at a glance, and it had taken a plain wooden box and a man in a gray uniform to teach her how much that glance had always missed. The box in the lobby was the same one that had shattered on the marble, mended so that its cracks still showed if you knew to look for them. And that was the whole point of it. It was no longer a gift that had been mocked. It had become the thing Charlotte passed every morning on her way to the top of the building, a small worn object that reminded her better than any success ever could that the true value of a gift was never in how it looked or what it cost to be you. Why? But in everything the giver had quietly given up to place it with an open heart in hands that had not been ready to receive.